things, you got to build relationships, and that takes emotions. And relationships get hurt by ideas and by strategy and by stuff, and that's also draining. And doing the work is draining. So journey is also saying, like, how do you learn and pay attention to the emotional, spiritual, and relational aspects of movement building as you are trying to heal and liberate through the other praxis-based concepts of movement building. So journeying was like a pretext, because this dissertation in itself is talking about multiple identities that I journey with. It's talking about how H.O.L.L.A is an iteration of other formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated non-traditional approaches of youth development and community development. So the idea itself is a journey. And then it's talking about like how some of the work we did with community, how it bubbled up over time, and how healing over time is a journey. And particularly going to chapter 1, when we talk about the problem. And this is another reason why journey is important, because the way that the dissertation framed the problem is around violence. And we start off with an opening quote. We first say that historical, structural, and interpersonal forms of violence. That's kind of like the intro title. And then we use a quote from Dr. Joy DeGeary that says, although slavery has long been a part of human history, American chattel slavery represents a case of human trauma uncomparable in scope, duration, and consequence to any other incidents in human enslavement. And then I go on to say the purpose of this research is to engage healing as a response to the problem of violence. And the way that I'm grappling with violence is saying that it has historical elements to it. It has structural elements to it. It has interpersonal elements to it. And the forces of those things in between each other, coming from the historical force, bleeds into like an intrapersonal aspect of the violence where you internalize certain things. So we talk about history, structures, interpersonal, and internalized violence. And I start off by talking about the historical or historical analysis of violence, really highlighting the work of Dr. Joy DeGeary and really the book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And Dr. Joy DeGeary really talks about how black people, particularly in the context of America, since the, you can think about the emancipation, you can think about the context of chattel slavery and the 400 plus years that black people were in bondage. But she also goes on to map out no healing or no wellness or no deep, like taking care of took place during that time or after that time for black people. And then after that time, with the 13th Amendment, there was an institutional structure built to keep locking people up, from convict leasing to sharecropping to the black codes, to the Jim Crow South, and to the Ku Klux Klan coming in and other white terrorists, to the breaking down of the Reconstruction era. So she maps out, even after chattel slavery, there's ongoing systematic, institutional, and state, and like just brute out like everyday experience of white supremacist violence that black people are experiencing across time. And she maps all of that out as like that leads to post-traumatic symptoms and realities in our development and our understanding of community, our understanding of relationships, our understanding of behaviors. That comes from this kind of context. So that was really important for the dissertation, really outlining this historical analysis of trauma and generational trauma and how it's passed on across generations. And that black people today is still experiencing new iterations of that same trauma and still having healed from many of the previous iterations of that old trauma. And then the second big idea in that historical trauma is really pulling on indigenous scholars, Mary Yellow Horse Braveheart theoretical framework of historical trauma and unresolved grief, and talking about there's a pain when there's a harm and a violence when your pain haven't been acknowledged. So we talk about this historical trauma, and we talk about chattel slavery, and we talk about when the 13th Amendment was instituted after chattel slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, and still violence structurally was enforced on communities, and even just letting people out of bondage, somewhere between 1 million and 4 million black people were released from slavery with no jobs, no homes, and a lot of them was separated from their family. So that also was a traumatic experience of releasing from slavery. So just in one spirit, being free from bondage was healing, but the way that they was released from slavery was another deep pain that is historical, that's still contemporary. That we don't know how to be our family. We don't know where our families are at. We still haven't got houses, and we still don't got homes or land to call our own. That's still seen in our everyday life today. Back to Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, theoretical understanding of unacknowledged grief, historically unacknowledged grief. That like there's a violence when your pain haven't been acknowledged. Like when people just don't recognize you going through something, and then that's passed on through generations. And there's also a pain when like people are not accountable to like harming something, like when no accountability happens, and no acknowledgement, no accountability. So that's a spiritual kind of hurt when you just kind of like feel like, yo, damn, somebody could like just take my land, and like that just happens. Like nobody says nothing, nobody cares about it. Somebody could like just take my daughters, take my snatch my children, snatch my culture, keep it, and like you begin to gain a spirit over time, over weeks, over years, over centuries, that could move you away from who you are, that could cause a deep pain of you internalizing it, of it being in your interpersonal relationships, or you thinking that might be regular. Or just you not having an opportunity to dream or live in a space outside of that kind of understanding. And also, like that unresolved grief is really getting at the spiritual wellness that is needed at the divine level of humanity. Like, for us to be humans, like we got to see each other. And part of like the divine level of like seeing each other is like just knowing when we hurt each other, saying sorry, acknowledging when we hurt each other. So you could write history, you could change schools, you could do all that, but if people at the divine level can't even acknowledge it, like you've been hurting me, like the question of like spiritually, are you being seen as a human? Are you being seen? I think unresolved grief, historically unresolved grief, really gets to that. So that was kind of really the outline for like the historical piece on violence. Then really pulling on black feminist ideas and intersectional analysis of violence, really started thinking about the structural impacts of violence, and really pull on the Combahee River Collective, who came together in the early 70s to really define their politics. They were a group of black feminists committed to struggling at the intersections of violence. Right? You know what I'm saying? So these black women understood that like violence wasn't just historical, and that it has impacts going across generations, that there was intersections, that there was like race intersections, that violence comes through a thread of race, that violence comes through a form of class, like depending on how much class you got, and that violence comes through a form of like gender, sexuality, and that you got to understand that these forms of violence, although they could all be historical, that you need to understand that the different lenses and the ways that these violences come in the race, in the form of gender, in the form of class, and think about them simultaneously. So shout out to our black women, and shout out to the Combahee River Collective. But there was many, sisters from Bell Hooks to Patricia Hill Collins, who really talked about standpoint and really understanding the formation of violence. So H.O.L.L.A, the dissertation, we really wanted to think about the historical, but understand that violence works through the intersections. And then another sister, Jamila Lyscott, really talks about, you know, like the different layers of violence too. So not only at the intersection, but the different layers within the intersections. So we got historical, we got the intersections, and then we got layers. And she named these layers as like, you know, you have at the idea, you know, certain ideas can inform like violence because they have certain notions about other people. And then she said, like, you know, going back to the institutions, you know, there's like institutional forms of violence. And then, like I said before, the violence works at the interpersonal level. So you got the idea, the ideological level, you got the institutional level, you got the interpersonal level, and then you got the internal level when you internalize it. So, you know, we lean on our sisters and we lean on particularly black radical feminist ideas around intersecting notions of violence at multiple intersecting locking points, but also at multiple levels within those locking points. And then within that, you know, our dissertation and its work really focused on violence at the interpersonal level. We pull on Miss Kaba work and a lot of folks, you know, in the Oakland area who've been doing work on transformative justice, and a lot of just women doing really important work talking about how do we have accountability and love and transformation that don't rely on the system. So a lot of the work talking about violence and how all of that historical and structural gets embodied in interpersonal dynamics really gave us a space to talk about how is some of our communities internalizing in this violence and how it plays out amongst each other, and then how we internalize it, how it plays out in our own self-esteem and our own emotion, our own ideas about ourselves. And then another part of that violence was just mapping out formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people's notions of violence and of the criminal punishment system as a new or continuation of chattel slavery. So shout out to the Greenhaven think tank, the Resurrection Study Group. Shout out to the formerly incarcerated convicted peoples and family movement. Shout out to Daryl Atkins, Susan Burton, Vivian Nixon, Norris Henderson, Deanna Hopkins, Eddie Ellis, Tina Reynolds, you know, to George and Courage, just to all of the formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people who really been talking about an analysis of violence, particularly from the punishment system for a long time. So we uplifted that. And then we kind of ended the section on violence talking about how that lands on youth development. Like that historical, structural, interpersonal violence that's in our homes, in our schools, in the institutions, in our neighborhoods, that still haven't received its grief, that we still haven't got social accountability, that lays onto young black, brown, and indigenous people, like the impacts of chattel slavery and contemporary systematic oppression snatch away dreams and ancestors and elders and community. And replace them things with drugs, with fear, with heterosexism, interpersonal violence, firearms, sexism, lack of self-esteem, no rituals, and more trauma from institutions that like dehumanize us. So this dissertation really talks about, we wanted to examine how do young people heal from that historical, structural, interpersonal, and internal violence, and really thinking about the punishment system as a thread within that whole violence, and really focus on a community-specific approach, a non-traditional approach to youth development and community organizing that's thinking about that history and how it plays into like youth development, and how can we study what we learned from applying this community-specific approach to respond to that historical, structural, interpersonal, and internal reality that our community is facing when it comes to violence. So that was chapter 1, man. That was chapter 1, the problem, breaking down violence. any other books that I want to highlight here. Well, I can highlight Donna's book. Here go a formerly incarcerated sister, Donna Hilton, A Little Piece of Light, talking about her experiences inside of prison. She's one of our elders, one of the sisters that come back into the dissertation again with Kathy and the rest of the Bedford Hill sisters in chapter 2. But she's also part of the analysis on violence that formerly incarcerated people have on the system. And some of her work is highlighted in chapter 1 when we talk about what violence means from a formerly incarcerated perspective. Also, this is actually Kathy Boudin's in the Center for Justice video. And this video is a old school, VCR cassette of PBS home video of What I Want My Words to Do. That was made in, what year was this made? 2003. And it's about 15 women that was in Bedford Hill prison. And they was doing poetry, sharing their stories. Some actors came in and started working with them. And another facilitator around healing was working with them around sharing their stories and what they went through as women in prison, before prison, and really talking about what they want their words to do. And they did a dope, monologue where the actors, Rosie Perez and others, shared their stories. But this video shows them going through that work and shows them having hard times trying to get some of their story out. But also the importance of sharing their story. And when we first heard this video when the co-founders of H.O.L.L.A was in prison and we was thinking about building H.O.L.L.A. So this is also really important to our legacy because we learned a lot about healing and just our family and what people are doing in prison by looking at this video. But also this video highlights the analysis on that formerly incarcerated people got about violence as well. So let's go into chapter 2, man. Chapter 2 is right here.